I was born in Toccoa, which is also a Cherokee word for the beautiful. It's a small town, so you see everybody, especially from middle school through high school, almost every day.
Sean Scott grows up as a devout Southern Baptist in the small town in Georgia where his parents meet in 1973.
My mom got pregnant, and they got married out of a sense of obligation to their Christian faith. They got divorced, and my mom met Don the next summer. The gentleman that I call my dad, Don Scott, adopted me in 1981. And I always felt like he dearly loved me. Dad never made me feel any different from the rest of the Scott family.
Don marries Sean's mother, and 8 years later, Sean's half-brother Daniel is born.
When I was very little, Sean and I were very close. He was my childhood hero. Sean was this rock star. Everyone knew who he was, everyone liked him, everyone was always wanting to talk to him. He was on the football team. That was the #1 football team in the state for many years. I wanted to do nothing more than to be Sean.
As he nears his junior year, Sean starts thinking about his future. He has huge aspirations for college, but his mom is an artist, and his stepdad is retired from the Navy.
And both my mom and dad sat me down and said, look, son, we're concerned that if you're going to go to college, you're going to have to figure out how to finance it yourself because we don't have the means to help you. So I started looking for all the schools that had cheap tuition, and then I landed on the United States Military Academy at West Point. And tuition per semester was $0. I'm like, wow, that's going to be easy to afford.
But West Point is the most prestigious military academy in the country and extremely difficult to get into.
So I spent a lot of time from 10th grade on in the guidance counselor's office. That's how I came into Trish Ellis's circle of awareness.
Trish Ellis, a bookkeeper at the school inside the guidance department, is the wife of a prominent pharmacist in town and the mother of Wendy Ellis.
Wendy was very outgoing and friendly, smiling all the time. She was a cheerleader.
I do remember Trish Ellis, Wendy's mother, being very, very much supportive of Sean. I believe that she saw that that would be very promising for her daughter.
Trish stops me one day and says, hey, Sean, Wendy is struggling in algebra. Do you mind tutoring her? And we'll be happy to pay you. I'm like, I'll do that for free. I'll pay you to do that. Wendy pretended to be struggling to learn and not be able to understand it. She would bat her eyes at me, which really excited me. I was just mesmerized by the radiant blue eyes that she had. I really enjoyed the interaction with Wendy.
During the last semester of his senior year, Sean notices that Wendy is absent from school.
I passed Trish's office and I said, hey, Trish, I haven't seen Wendy in school in like 2 weeks. Is she all right? And she says, oh, well, it's pretty sad, but she's in the hospital down near Atlanta for a eating disorder, bulimia, and anorexia.
Sean decides to show support for Wendy and visits her.
When I came in, she looked pitiful. When she saw me, she just lit up. Her eyes got wide. She said, Sean, you came to see me. And that just got me right there. It's probably the initial seed that made me ask her to go with me to our senior prom.
Sean is delighted when Wendy recovers and agrees to go to the prom with him.
The night before my prom, I got home and there was all this paperwork laid out. There's a set of orders with my name on it, and there's instructions to coordinate travel to West Point. I was so relieved. The next afternoon, I picked up Wendy. We took pictures, and then we were off to dinner, and then to the high school gymnasium.
The news of Sean's acceptance into West Point spreads throughout the dance.
Herb and Trish Ellis were chaperones, and they looked like they were overjoyed. Wendy said, "Oh, everyone is so proud of you, and I love you so much." You know, that night, I probably said I love you so that she would kiss me again.
Sean and Wendy grow closer, but once he's at West Point for his freshman year, Sean's schedule is regimented from sunup to sundown.
We were busy. Every time we went to the payphones for the privilege of a very brief phone call, my number one priority was to call Wendy. My second priority was to call my parents.
Wendy tells Sean she is still struggling with her eating disorder, but being in New York makes it hard for him to help her back home in Georgia.
When I was home on leave, Wendy asked me if I would go to one of her psych appointments. I was wholly and consciously aware that Wendy had long-term mental health challenges.
I believe that the protective nature of Sean would draw him to try to help someone like her. She's beautiful, she's well-known, the family's well-known, she has a problem, so naturally a protective person like that would want to try to shelter that person and help fix them.
At West Point, the years in the calendar seem to fly by, but every day seems like it's an eternity. So, in order to help make the experience tolerable, there are a series of milestone events that include a speech, a ball, a dinner, and one of those is called 500th Night.
The event takes place during Sean's junior year, and Wendy's parents drive her from Georgia to New York to celebrate.
They allowed Wendy and I to have some private time alone. Wendy and I enjoyed a wonderful night, and I was really excited and proud to show off my girlfriend from my hometown. It was just like a night of joy and excitement.
With only one more year till Sean's graduation, the future looks bright if they can get a handle on Wendy's health issues.
One day we were out shopping together, and she just fainted right there in the store. She refused to have an ambulance called. She said that she had diabetes. I had no clue she had diabetes.
Wendy Scott is a very manipulative woman, and she's very dangerous.
She craved attention and affection from others, and she went to any length to get that.
Now I don't know what to believe.
Sean Scott is at West Point when he finds out that his girlfriend Wendy has another serious health complaint.
When I found out that Wendy had diabetes, I was very concerned for her health. She told me that the insulin that she had, she did not get from a doctor. Her father got it from his pharmacy that he worked at and gave it to her. Only once did I actually see her inject herself with insulin. I loved her, and I wanted to be a support to her and to help her in any way that I can.
Sean seemed happy with Wendy. but there was always something about her that made me feel uncomfortable. There was just always that little feeling in me that just made me feel unsure about her.
By Sean's third year at West Point, his relationship with Wendy has evolved. However, he suffers a devastating loss in his family in April 1996 when his stepdad becomes seriously ill.
I made it home on emergency leave from West Point just in time.
I remember Sean opening the door to the ICU in his uniform from West Point and running through the ICU to my father's side. And then I was taken out of the room, but I remember looking back and seeing Sean sitting there holding his hand.
I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. And I held on to it until I felt, the warmth leave.
The next year, Sean's stepdad's absence is felt at his graduation from West Point. But Sean is able to celebrate with Wendy and family.
My mom, my brother, Herb, Trish, Wendy's grandparents came and attended. I was full of pride and exuberance. And people in my hometown that were there, I was going to get to shake hands with the President of the United States. It was just a great day all around.
A few days later, Sean and Wendy drive from New York to Georgia to elope, without family present.
Wendy and I got married in a tiny little chapel on June 3rd, 1997. My best friend Joe was my best man, and he brought along his wife. Wendy was over the top. She acted as if she was about to faint. She did not focus on me. She had a hard time getting through her vows. So that part was kind of bizarre. We had made plans for a honeymoon, and we drove straight through the night to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Wendy was not interested in any physical intimacy, and she said that she was feeling physically ill, and that was a great disappointment. But to me, that was not as important as abiding by my vow to love, cherish, and care for her in sickness and in health. I was okay with that because there are higher priorities than my own carnal satisfaction.
A year later, in 1998, after taking the U.S. Army Engineer Officers course, Wendy and Sean moved to Columbia, Georgia, just a few hours from home.
My first permanent duty station in the Army was Fort Benning in Georgia. And we went and did fun things by ourselves and with other people, my West Point classmates included.
Later that year, Hurricane Mitch devastates Central America, and Sean is deployed as part of the Army Corps of Engineers. When Sean returns to Fort Benning, he finds Wendy in a health crisis.
Wendy had gotten a referral to an oncologist because there were some irregularities in her blood work. She told me, "Oh my God, Sean, what if I have cancer?" And then the oncologist broke the news to me that he felt, in his professional opinion, Wendy had leukemia. I couldn't believe it. It was just another shock. I never shaved my own head, but I helped her shave hers. I rarely cried. I definitely cried tears that dripped on her head while I was helping her shave it. She was so grateful, and we had intimate contact that we hadn't had in months or maybe even in years at that point.
Wendy tells Sean that she wants to do the treatments on her own, so as not to distract him from his work.
She said, "I've found a specialist that can treat me right here at the hospital. You can just drop me off in the morning, and then I'll find a ride home." While she was going to chemotherapy, there was less strange behavior, and all the other antics faded away.
Wendy starts her treatment, and Sean believes that all is going well, until one day, he is summoned to a meeting with some other Army spouses at Fort Benning.
It was a historic home of a colonel, and Wendy was sitting there, and she looked up at me, had a very nervous look on her face, and was very fidgety. You could hear a pin drop. One of the spouses said, "We have discovered that Wendy does not really have cancer. She's been lying to us, and we've all been deeply hurt by this." I couldn't say anything. I was filled with rage.
Second Lieutenant Sean Scott has been told by a group of Army spouses that his wife Wendy is faking having cancer.
I was just devastated, embarrassed. I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't say anything except thank you for bringing this to my attention. I am so sorry that this happened. I learned that one of the church community saw her at the hospital. She just walked around like a normal person, and she wasn't behaving like she would behave at church, where she would present as if she was deathly ill and unable to perform activities of daily living on her own and needed help.
But how did Wendy trick her oncologist into a leukemia diagnosis?
I was finally coming to grips with an escalating pattern of behavior. I believe Wendy figured out how to manipulate her body so that her blood work came back such that more than one medical provider was convinced that she had leukemia.
He had worked very hard to get to where he was, and he had a very promising career ahead of him. The situation that she put them in could very much damage his entire career.
I was committed to her because I considered marriage my bond with Wendy and with God. And I wasn't going to give up on that, and I was determined not to get a divorce. I decided that I was going to monitor and control her behavior as best I could.
For the next 2 years, Sean focuses on the demands of his career and spends less and less time with Wendy. In April of 2002, he is notified that Wendy is in the ER because of a complication related to her diabetes.
The physician on call was present. After the whole cancer thing, I knew from then on that she was faking. She found some new docs who didn't know her backstory. I said, "Look, doc, I respect what you do, and I just want you to know that I know without a shadow of a doubt that my wife does not have diabetes. Never had." He paused, looked at me in the eyes for a second and said, "Okay, would you like for me to put her on a 72-hour hold?" I came in and told her she was going to a psych ward, and she was livid. She was throwing objects at me. She was yelling at me.
And Wendy has one more bomb to drop.
A nurse came in and said, "We got your blood results. Wendy was pregnant."
On December 13th, 2002, Sean and Wendy's daughter is born with hydrocephalus, a condition that will require multiple surgeries.
When our daughter was born, Wendy's behaviors regarding her own health just disappeared. It was like magic. I found out that I was deploying. I was amped and energized and excited to exercise my leadership in the role of company commander.
Sean is deployed to Kuwait, but gets emergency medical leave to return to the U.S. in March 2004.
I was back in the States in Chapel Hill, North Carolina for the first of a series of brain surgeries for our daughter at a UNC Medical Center. My personal belief is that the hydrocephalus condition, which was diagnosed as Chiari malformation, was congenital. In 2004, my daughter began developing symptoms from vomiting to abnormal eating behavior to constant diarrhea.
Sean is now stationed at Fort Detrick, Maryland, so that the family can be close to Walter Reed Medical Center, where their daughter is a frequent visitor.
The doctors were unsure as to what exactly was wrong. They were pursuing the option of leukemia, and they were doing everything that they could to help her.
Over the next 3 years, Sean and Wendy pull closer together. Wendy is no longer faking health issues and gives birth to a son who is underweight but otherwise healthy. At Walter Reed, the doctors cannot determine the cause of Sean's daughter's ongoing symptoms.
My daughter underwent hundreds of diagnostic procedures. The spinal tap, that's an extremely painful procedure, and it was gut-wrenching, heartbreaking to be present and in the room with her.
In June of 2007, Sean gets a call from Wendy.
There's going to be a multidisciplinary team meeting. So all the specialists, along with the primary care manager, meet in a room with the parents, and one of the lead GI physicians laid a bombshell. There are levels of magnesium in your daughter's system that I cannot account for. So that tells me that either you pointing at me or you pointing at Wendy or both of you have been giving your daughter magnesium of some form. And Wendy confessed on the spot. I did it, and I looked at her in front of all these people. All I could say was, how could you?
The place that you have to be mentally to do something like that to an innocent little child, you would have to be.
Sean Scott's 4-year-old daughter has undergone dozens of medical procedures for various health issues since her birth. His wife Wendy has now admitted to poisoning her. The state takes custody of the Scott children.
Anger doesn't even come close. It's more like rage. I was shocked, stunned, sickened, saddened. I drove Wendy home, and she cried, and she blabbered on to me about how we still have to stick together as a family. I just looked at her and I was like, will you shut up? Or I was going to wreck the car and kill both of us.
In June 2007, I received a call from Fort Detrick advising me that they had just received a call from Walter Reed and they believed they had a child abuse case. They advised that the mother of the child had been confronted by the doctor and actually admitted that she had been poisoning her child and that she was withdrawing blood from the child as well. I knew about Munchausen by proxy, what they call it today, fictitious disorder by proxy. And immediately it triggered into my mind that I may have one of those cases. In a Munchausen by proxy case, the person themselves is Munchausen. And they cause their own illnesses or injuries to gain attention. And normally it's when they can't get attention for themselves anymore that they move on to a child.
Agent Smith calls FBI headquarters to talk to a profiler.
I knew that I was going to have to approach this interview differently. The behavioral analysis profiler told me to make the interview completely about her, to not talk about her children and the things that she did to the child, but to talk about how it affected her and how it made her feel. Just focus the entire interview on Wendy. I walked in, the chaplain was there, and Wendy Scott was there. You're expecting a monster, but in fact, she actually looks like a little child herself. She comes across very innocent, very naive, someone that you want to protect. Wendy showed absolutely no remorse during the interview. I realized that I did in fact have a Munchausen by proxy case, that she was truly injuring her child to gain attention for herself. And so my goal at that point was to get as much evidence as I could. I was able to get consent from Wendy to search the house. The home that the Scotts lived in was in a very nice area. The house was very organized and clean. Similarly, so was the victim child's bedroom. It was a beautiful bedroom. It looked like she cared very deeply for this child by the way that the room was presented. I spoke to the team leader of our evidence response team that went directly to the kitchen trash can. And sure enough, at the top of the trash can was a large bottle of milk and magnesia. And I saw a red hazmat box, the type you find in a doctor's office where you put expended syringes in. And inside were 5 syringes with blood in them. I actually took the photo books to see if they told any type of story. I was able to see things such as the child had straight hair. And I saw that Wendy had taken pictures of this victim child when she was putting curlers in her hair. I later interviewed the doctors at Walter Reed. They all described her as looking like Shirley Temple, who had curly hair. She wanted her daughter to look adorable and all the doctors to fall in love with her, to be the cutest kid on the floor, if you will. Wendy would do the child's hair in advance the night before, and then she would do something to the child to induce the symptoms that resulted in her bringing the child to the hospital. So it showed premeditation. I did learn through my investigation that Wendy herself had feigned illness at a previous space. She claimed she had leukemia, she was in a wheelchair, she'd shaved her head, she even shaved her eyebrows, literally had everyone absolutely convinced that she had it. She figured out a way to cause those type of symptoms in herself, and she was trying to do the same thing to her daughter.
Sean must now prove he is a fit parent to regain custody of his children.
I had a court date immediately. I had to hire my own attorney.
It was really devastating to him. But he picked himself up and began to make sure the children had a stable, safe place to be.
The evidence, timing, and Sean's record of conduct eventually exonerate him from suspicion.
Sean Scott had been serving his country, only to find that the enemy was not abroad. The enemy was in his own household, nearly killing his child. When the victim and the younger sibling were in Sean Scott's custody, they immediately started improving. The symptoms that the child presented with at Walter Reed Medical Center never, ever recurred.
After convincing a judge that I was a fit parent, I got legal custody of my children.
The case goes from FBI jurisdiction during the investigation to Maryland state prosecutors as they prepare for an indictment.
Agent Smith reviewed with me the information she received from Dr. Delormier, the attending physician at Walter Reed Medical Center. This woman was causing her child a near-death medical condition. The symptoms progressed to dramatic blood loss to the point where on 3 different occasions that the child had to be transfused. Dr. Delormier testified that the child could very well have died with the amount of blood that was taken from her system. It was dangerous enough that as a prosecutor, I had to make sure that she never had contact with that child again, with her younger child, or with any child. That was my focus.
On November 16, 2007, Wendy Scott is indicted on 15 charges.
She was charged with at least 2 counts of first-degree child abuse, second-degree child abuse, first-degree assault, second-degree assault, and reckless endangerment.
On March 13, 2008, Wendy Scott pleads guilty to first-degree child abuse.
In exchange for dismissing the remaining counts, the defense agreed that at sentencing, the parties would be free to argue as to what the appropriate sentence would be.
Wendy's sentencing hearing takes place 2 months later.
When she first came into court, she was just fluttering around, smiling, talking to people. It was clear she wanted to be the center of attention. But she did not testify during the sentencing hearing. The state presented testimony principally from Dr. Delormier. He was so incensed by this whole incident and what that child had suffered. Because of the blood loss levels, the myriad of tests that she had had to undergo, the radiology she was subjected to, his testimony went to the permanency of the injury to that young victim. The defense, they were arguing that she didn't intend to hurt the child. The only reason she was doing it was because of her own mental disorder. She had been diagnosed with a borderline personality disorder. One of the manifestations of that was the fictitious disorder and fictitious disorder by proxy. But she knew that the blood she was withdrawing was causing the child to be transfused at least 3 times. And for her to say that she didn't know that what she was doing was causing harm is just not defensible.
Concerned that Wendy will present a further risk to her daughter if she gets a light sentence, the prosecution presents surprising evidence that her disorder is deeply rooted. Even while on bail, Wendy had been exhibiting classic fictitious disorder behaviors.
She decided to get a job, and while she was there, I discovered that she was faking cancer and diabetes. She would go on her lunch break and sit in her car on a 90+ degree day, and then passing out, and that the ambulance would be called. She submits a request to this employer requesting time off, saying that she had lymphoma and that she needed to go for chemo on a weekly basis.
She was engaging in this very type of behavior, even at a time where she was participating in counseling and under the supervision of a psychiatric professional. She was doing this again.
This revelation seals Wendy's fate with the judge.
The judge sentenced her to 15 years of active incarceration and 5 years of supervised probation.
I had finally come to the realization that she was never going to stop doing this.
Sean takes off his wedding ring, files for divorce, and visits Wendy in jail one last time.
Within a couple of seconds of visiting her, and she looked down and she held my hand and she said, "Why did you take off your ring? Someone will fall in love with you. You can't do that." So I was just like, "I'm sorry." And she's like, "I think you need to go."
After 11 years of trauma, Sean is free to find love with a new partner and discovers there is light at the end of the tunnel.
My brother and Sean worked together at Walter Reed. We were both going through divorces about the same time, and we were friends. I wanted to help Sean primarily because I knew what a wonderful man he was. As a mother, it's an overwhelming story to hear. It still hurts to this day. And I felt terrible for him because it was a lot. And as a mom, like, our kids are close in age, so it really hit home. Our friendship grew more and more. Once his divorce was final, it was like an instant connection. Sean's children needed a lot of healing and love and support due to the damage that was caused by Wendy Scott.
In 2010, Sean and Rachel marry and blend their families. Rachel becomes the loving and protective mother Sean's kids have never known.
While Sean was deployed to Afghanistan, Wendy submitted a request for reconsideration. She wanted to reduce her prison time, and we feel that she coordinated that request in knowing that Sean was in Afghanistan, and so they attended that request. It was probably the most terrifying day of my life because I really didn't want to see Wendy in person, but I was also proud to speak on the kid's behalf because he was obviously not able to be there.
For the first time since her arrest, Wendy takes the stand.
You start by telling him your name.
Wendy Michelle Scott.
You have any children?
Yes, I do.
She obviously presented a very positive picture of her accomplishments.
Do you currently believe you're a danger to the community?
No, I am not.
Not one mention was made about the child. She knew that her counseling would not be successful if she was not able to be honest. So I asked her, tell me what you did to your daughter.
Miss Scott, could you tell us please what you did to...
And she was very taken aback by that. The defense, of course, objected to it, and the judge wanted to hear the answer too. She hemmed and she hawed.
Miss Angel, I am not a doctor. I cannot honestly, under oath, say that I know exactly what I did to her. I don't know.
And I don't think she ever really did answer my question. I just said, I have nothing more. I don't have any more questions.
And then I read a victim impact statement. She works hard every single day of her life to try to be a typical kid. She will be scarred forever. It is something that we will deal with for the rest of her life. And part of that was I had said that his daughter had her feeding tube removed, and as I was saying that, there was a cheer from Wendy, like, yay! Thank goodness I had the DA and the FBI agent on both sides of me because I think I would have done something mean. She did this to her daughter, and I'm the one that, along with Sean, we got rid of it and reached that milestone together. The damage and the harm that she did to an innocent little girl is just baffling. I think it's evil.
Ms. Scott, that sentence I imposed then is appropriate, and it remains appropriate. You nearly killed her, and your motion to modify is denied.
Wendy loses the appeal for a shortened sentence and serves her full term.
Sean and the kids are in a much better place. We all had to do the hard work together as a family. One of my proudest moments was to be by his side when he was promoted to lieutenant colonel because his career was almost destroyed because of Wendy. All 4 kids were at the ceremony, and of course, I cried. But it was just a very special day.
Sean is a proud and intensely private man, but he tells his story to warn others.
I'm at peace with it now. I'm okay. I cherish and appreciate the love and support that my wife and my children and my extended family and all my friends have given me to be able to get to the point. My purpose and mission will be to help somebody out there who's doubting themselves. Take action, don't hesitate, seek help. If you got doubts or questions, talk to somebody.
Sean is joyful in his new life and has high hopes for the future of his children.
They're strong, resilient children. I'm very proud of them. They're going to go on to do great things in their own right out there.
On the morning of May 24, 2019, Jennifer Dulos drove her children to school as she had done countless times before. There was nothing about that morning that announced what was coming. No warning siren. No dramatic confrontation in the street. No stranger waiting in the shadows. Just an ordinary Connecticut morning, the kind of morning that can pass almost unnoticed until years later, when every small detail becomes painfully important. Jennifer was 50 years old. She was a mother of 5 children, and for years her life had revolved around the routines that quietly hold a family together. School drop-offs. Appointments. Messages. Meals. Plans for the weekend. The countless small responsibilities that rarely make headlines but consume the hours of an ordinary life. That morning, she took her children to the New Canaan Country School. Then she drove home. And somewhere between the school and her house on Wells Lane, the final ordinary morning of Jennifer Dulos's life came to an end. She would never be seen alive again. At first, no one knew that. That is what makes the opening hours of this case so haunting. There was no immediate understanding that a crime had occurred. Jennifer did not disappear in the middle of a crowded public place. She did not vanish while traveling across the country. She simply returned home, and then, somehow, she was gone. Later, investigators would focus intensely on the period between approximately 8:05 in the morning and 10:25. Those 2 hours would become the center of a mystery that stretched across Connecticut, through surveillance footage, phone records, abandoned vehicles, discarded trash bags, forensic evidence, courtroom testimony, and years of unanswered questions. But on that morning, Jennifer was simply a woman going home. Her children had been dropped off at school. The day was supposed to continue. There were still places she was expected to be. There were still people who expected to hear from her. There were still ordinary obligations waiting for her. Instead, something happened inside or around her home that would permanently alter the lives of everyone who knew her. By the evening, Jennifer was missing. And investigators would eventually discover evidence suggesting that she had not simply walked away. They would find what appeared to be blood in her garage. They would find signs that someone may have attempted to clean the area. They would locate her vehicle abandoned several miles away. And then cameras would begin revealing a disturbing trail of movement through Hartford. A man would be seen stopping repeatedly. A series of garbage bags would be discarded. Investigators would begin collecting those bags. And what they found inside would transform a missing person investigation into a presumed murder case. But the most disturbing part was still ahead. Because the person investigators would ultimately accuse of killing Jennifer was not a stranger. It was her estranged husband. Fotis Dulos. Jennifer and Fotis had been married since 2004. Together, they had built a family of 5 children. From the outside, there had once been the appearance of an established family life, a home, children, routines, and a future. But behind that picture, the marriage had deteriorated. In 2017, Jennifer filed for divorce. What followed was not a quiet separation. The divorce became increasingly bitter, particularly over custody of their children. Jennifer moved with the children to New Canaan, while Fotis remained in Farmington. He later lived with Michelle Triconis, a woman who would eventually become another central figure in the investigation. The details of the marriage and divorce would later become critical to understanding the case, but they would also become deeply contested. Some allegations came from court filings and statements made during the custody dispute. Some were presented by prosecutors. Others were denied by the people accused of wrongdoing. And that distinction matters. Because this is not a story where every accusation can simply be treated as proven fact. What is known is that the relationship between Jennifer and Fotis had become deeply strained. What is known is that Jennifer had expressed fears about what might happen as the divorce progressed. And what is known is that, less than 2 years after she filed for divorce, Jennifer would disappear. The timeline would eventually become brutally precise. At some point after dropping her children at school, Jennifer returned to her home. At some point during the morning, investigators believe a violent encounter took place. And by the time the children needed their mother again, she was no longer there. Imagine the scene from the perspective of someone who knew nothing yet. A house in New Canaan. A driveway. A garage. A vehicle. A home that should have contained the familiar signs of a mother preparing for another day. Instead, something was wrong. Hours passed. Jennifer did not appear where she was expected to appear. She did not answer. The people around her began to notice the silence. At first, perhaps there were ordinary explanations. Maybe her phone had been turned off. Maybe she had become busy. Maybe something unexpected had happened. But the longer she remained unreachable, the harder those explanations became to accept. By the time evening approached, concern had become fear. At approximately 7 o'clock that evening, Jennifer was reported missing. Police began searching. And then came the discovery that changed everything. Inside the garage, investigators found what appeared to be blood. The evidence was not consistent with the simple disappearance of someone who had decided to leave. There were indications that someone may have tried to clean the area. A vehicle was present. The home was there. But Jennifer was not. Then investigators located her Toyota Suburban. It was found approximately 3 miles from her home, near Lapham Road and Waveney Park. The vehicle was abandoned. Jennifer was nowhere nearby. The discovery raised a question that would remain at the heart of the investigation. Why would Jennifer's vehicle be there? If she had driven there herself, where had she gone? If she had not driven there herself, who had moved the vehicle? And what had happened between the moment she left her home and the moment the vehicle was abandoned? Investigators began reconstructing the morning. Every minute mattered. Every camera mattered. Every phone call mattered. Every movement mattered. And as the investigation expanded, attention turned toward Fotis Dulos. His movements on the day Jennifer disappeared became increasingly important. Phone data placed him in areas investigators believed were connected to the case. Surveillance cameras provided another layer of evidence. And along Albany Avenue in Hartford, investigators began finding something extraordinary. Cameras had captured a pattern of activity involving numerous stops. According to investigators, Fotis stopped at more than 30 locations along a stretch of Albany Avenue more than 4 miles long. At those locations, garbage bags were discarded. One bag. Then another. Then another. To someone watching the footage without knowing the context, the movements might have seemed insignificant. A man driving through the city. A vehicle stopping briefly. A bag being carried to a trash container. Then the vehicle moving on. But investigators knew what they were looking for. They began recovering the discarded bags. And inside some of them were objects that prosecutors would later argue were connected to Jennifer and to an attempt to conceal evidence. The case was no longer simply about where Jennifer had gone. It was becoming a question of what had happened to her. And the closer investigators looked, the more disturbing the picture became. There was the blood. There was the abandoned vehicle. There were the surveillance recordings. There was the phone data. There were the discarded bags. And there was a marriage that had ended in a bitter custody dispute. Piece by piece, investigators began constructing a timeline. But one thing was missing. Jennifer herself. There was no body. No grave. No final confirmed sighting after she returned home. No place where her family could go and say goodbye. For the people who loved Jennifer, the absence would become its own kind of torment. They could search. They could wait. They could ask questions. But they could not touch the person they were searching for. They could not bring her home. And for years, that would remain true. The investigation would eventually lead to arrests. Fotis Dulos would be charged with murder, felony murder, and kidnapping. Michelle Traconis would face her own criminal case. Kent Mawini, a friend and former attorney of Fotis, would also be charged in connection with an alleged murder conspiracy. But before any courtroom testimony, before any verdicts, before lawyers argued over evidence and witnesses described what they believed had happened, there was only one terrifying fact. Jennifer Dulos had disappeared. And the last known morning of her life had begun like any other. That is the cruelty of cases like this. They do not always begin with a scream. Sometimes they begin with a mother buckling her children into a car. Sometimes they begin with a school drop-off. Sometimes they begin with someone driving home, believing there will still be an afternoon, an evening, a tomorrow. Jennifer had every reason to believe that day would continue. Her children expected their mother to come back. Her family expected to hear from her. People in her life expected another ordinary day. But somewhere inside those quiet morning hours, the future that Jennifer had imagined disappeared. And as investigators would later reconstruct the timeline, the question became increasingly difficult to escape. What happened inside those 2 hours? What happened between the moment Jennifer returned home and the moment her vehicle was later found abandoned? Who entered her world that morning? Who left? And where did Jennifer go? For the investigators who first arrived at her home, the answers were hidden in details that did not immediately make sense. For her family, the answers were hidden somewhere in the silence. And for the 5 children who had seen their mother that morning, there would eventually be a terrible realization. The person who had driven them to school would never come back to pick them up. Jennifer Dulos had not simply missed an appointment. She had not simply disappeared for a few hours. She was gone. And before the sun had set on May 24, 2019, a quiet Connecticut neighborhood had become the beginning of one of the most closely watched missing person investigations in the state. The search for Jennifer had begun. But what investigators would uncover next would force them to confront something far darker than a disappearance. They would have to consider that Jennifer had been attacked in her own home. They would have to follow a trail that led away from New Canaan and toward Hartford. They would have to examine every movement, every discarded bag, every fragment of evidence. And eventually, they would have to ask whether the woman they were searching for had become the victim of a carefully concealed homicide. For Jennifer's family, however, there was only one thought that mattered. Find her. Bring her home. Tell the children where their mother was. But the investigation would soon reveal the cruelest obstacle of all. The person at the center of the mystery could no longer speak for herself. And the man accused of knowing what happened to her would never live long enough to stand before a jury. The story of Jennifer Dulos was about to become a story of evidence without a body, accusations without a completed trial, and a family forced to live with questions that could not be answered. But it all began with a simple morning. A mother. 5 children. A drive to school. And a road home from which Jennifer would never return. Part 2, The Life Behind the Headlines. Before Jennifer Dulos became the subject of a statewide search, before investigators began studying surveillance footage frame by frame, before her name appeared beside words like murder, kidnapping, and disappearance, she was simply Jennifer. A mother. A daughter. A friend. A woman whose life was made up of thousands of ordinary moments that would later become precious to the people who loved her. To understand why her disappearance became so devastating, it is important to slow down and look at the world she had built before everything fell apart. Jennifer Farber was 50 years old when she disappeared. She lived in New Canaan, Connecticut, a community known for its quiet streets, large homes, manicured lawns, and the sense of privacy that often comes with suburban life. It was the kind of place where people could believe that terrible things happened somewhere else. Not here. Not on streets lined with trees. Not in houses where children went to school every morning and families followed familiar routines. But Jennifer's story would eventually challenge that sense of safety. Her life had already changed dramatically before May 24, 2019. For years, she had been married to Fotis Dulos. Together, they had 5 children. Their family life had once revolved around the rhythms shared by parents everywhere: school schedules, meals, birthdays, holidays, homework, appointments, and the constant responsibility of raising children. From the outside, the family could appear established and secure. But marriages can fracture long before the people around them realize how deep the damage has become. By 2017, Jennifer had filed for divorce. The decision was not simply the ending of a relationship. It became the beginning of a legal and personal struggle that would dominate the final years of her life. The central issue was her children. 5 children. 5 young lives caught in the middle of a bitter separation. Jennifer moved to New Canaan with them, while Fotis remained in Farmington. The physical distance between their homes was not enormous, but emotionally, the separation represented a growing divide. The divorce proceedings became increasingly contentious. There were disputes over custody. There were allegations. There were fears. There were court filings in which each side presented a different version of the family situation. And as the conflict intensified, Jennifer expressed concerns about what might happen. Those concerns would later become an important part of the story told by investigators and prosecutors. But they must be understood carefully. Some of the most disturbing claims surrounding the marriage came from legal filings and accusations made during a bitter custody battle. Not every allegation was proven in a criminal courtroom, and Fotis was never convicted of Jennifer's murder. That distinction is essential, because the tragedy of this case does not require exaggeration. The known facts are already devastating. A mother disappeared. Her home contained evidence investigators believed was connected to a violent attack. Her vehicle was found abandoned. Her estranged husband was eventually charged with her murder. And her body was never recovered. But before those facts became part of a criminal investigation, Jennifer was living through a much more private struggle. The divorce had transformed the structure of her family. The children were no longer simply living inside one household. They were living between 2 parents who were increasingly divided. Every decision could become a legal issue. Every disagreement could become another battle. And behind the formal language of court documents were 5 children who had no control over the conflict surrounding them. Jennifer's greatest concern was not simply where she would live. It was what would happen to her children. That concern would later make the case even more painful. Because when Jennifer disappeared, her children did not disappear with her. They remained. They had to wake up the next morning. They had to go on living. They had to understand, as best they could, why their mother was suddenly absent. And they had to do this while the adults around them were trying to understand what had happened. Meanwhile, Fotis continued his own life in Farmington. He was no longer living as Jennifer's husband in the traditional sense. He was living with Michelle Triconis, who would eventually become deeply involved in the criminal investigation. Triconis was not simply a peripheral figure. Her relationship with Fotis placed her directly inside the complicated emotional and legal landscape surrounding Jennifer. When Jennifer disappeared, investigators began examining the movements and communications of everyone connected to her. That meant the past could no longer remain in the past. Every argument, every custody dispute, every threat alleged in court filings, every change in living arrangements, every relationship, every financial concern, All of it became relevant. The investigation would eventually turn Jennifer's private life into public evidence. And that is one of the most uncomfortable realities of a high-profile criminal case. A person's most intimate struggles can become courtroom exhibits. Private messages can be read aloud. Family arguments can be reconstructed by strangers. Personal fears can become evidence. And the victim herself is no longer there to explain what she meant. Jennifer could not sit in a courtroom and tell a jury what she had experienced. She could not correct an interpretation. She could not answer a question. She could not explain what had happened inside her home. Her voice existed only through the records, statements, writings, and memories she had left behind. That made every piece of information about her life incredibly important. But it also required caution. Because Jennifer was more than the woman described in court documents. She was more than a missing person. More than a name on a police bulletin. More than a victim. She was a mother who had 5 children waiting for her. She was someone with a history that existed long before the day investigators arrived at her house. And perhaps the most tragic part of the story is that the public would come to know her most clearly through the circumstances of her disappearance. Her life would be divided into 2 chapters. Before May 24th. And after. The first chapter was filled with ordinary life. The second would be filled with investigators, attorneys, courtrooms, searches, evidence, accusations, and grief. The dividing line was a single morning. May 24, 2019. To understand what happened that morning, investigators first had to understand the environment surrounding Jennifer. Her home in New Canaan was not simply a location on a map. It was where she lived. It was where her children returned. It was part of the life she had created after leaving the family home in Farmington. And according to investigators, it was also where the violence occurred. That fact would make the case especially disturbing. Home is supposed to be the place where a person can lower their guard. The place where the outside world stops at the front door. The place where ordinary routines become predictable. Jennifer knew her home. She knew the driveway. She knew the garage. She knew the rooms. She knew where her children kept their things. She knew what every ordinary sound meant. Yet investigators would eventually believe that something happened there that morning that transformed the house from a home into a crime scene. The details would emerge slowly. Not all at once. First came the disappearance. Then the vehicle. Then the blood. Then the surveillance footage. Then the discarded bags. Each discovery made the previous one more disturbing. And behind all of it was the unanswered question of motive. Why Jennifer? Why that day? Why at her home? Why did she disappear without a trace? Investigators would eventually argue that the answer was connected to the collapse of the marriage and the ongoing custody dispute. But motive in a criminal case is never as simple as saying that a relationship was unhappy. People divorce every day. People argue over custody every day. People become angry with one another every day. Most do not become murder victims. Most do not become murder suspects. So investigators had to look beyond the existence of marital conflict. They had to determine what happened specifically on May 24th. They needed a timeline. They needed physical evidence. They needed digital evidence. They needed witnesses. They needed to know who had access to Jennifer. They needed to know where the people connected to her were that morning. And most importantly, they needed to know whether the disappearance was voluntary or the result of violence. The first hours suggested the latter. The blood found in the garage was difficult to ignore. The location of Jennifer's vehicle was difficult to explain. Her failure to contact the people who depended on her was deeply unusual. And the longer the search continued, the more investigators began treating the case as something far more serious than a missing person investigation. The possibility of homicide began to dominate the investigation. But Jennifer's body was still missing. Without a body, investigators faced a difficult challenge. How do you prove what happened to someone when the most important physical evidence is gone? The answer would come from reconstruction. A murder scene does not always end where the victim disappears. Sometimes the scene continues through the movements of the suspect. Through a phone. Through a car. Through a camera. Through a discarded object. Through something thrown into a trash container that the person responsible believed would never be found. And this case would become a powerful example of how modern investigations can reconstruct a crime from fragments. The investigators did not have one single piece of evidence that answered every question. Instead, they had a collection of fragments. One fragment placed a person somewhere. Another showed a vehicle. Another showed a bag being discarded. Another connected an object to Jennifer. Another suggested an attempt to clean a location. And slowly, the fragments began to form a picture. But there was another person whose role investigators would need to examine closely. Michelle Tragedies. She was Fotis' partner. She lived with him. She knew him. She knew about the divorce. She knew about the custody battle. And after Jennifer disappeared, investigators believed Tragedies had information about what happened. At first, however, the investigation did not immediately result in murder charges. The case developed gradually. In June 2019, Fotis and Tragedies were arrested on charges related to the handling of evidence and obstruction. They denied wrongdoing. The arrests demonstrated that investigators believed there had already been actions taken after Jennifer disappeared that were potentially connected to concealing evidence. But the central accusation had not yet fully arrived. The question remained: where was Jennifer? As the months passed, the investigation continued. Search teams worked across Connecticut. Police examined locations connected to the people involved. Investigators followed leads. They reviewed surveillance footage. They analyzed phone data. They searched for physical evidence. And Jennifer's family continued to wait. For them, every search represented hope and terror at the same time. A search could mean investigators were getting closer. But it could also mean they were searching for a body. That distinction is difficult for anyone outside such a case to understand. When a loved one is missing, hope can survive inside uncertainty. As long as there is no final answer, the mind can imagine possibilities. Maybe she is alive. Maybe she will come home. Maybe someone will find her. But as evidence of violence accumulates, hope becomes harder to protect. Jennifer's family had to confront the possibility that she would never return. Her children had to live with that uncertainty. And the investigators had to continue working without the one piece of evidence that could have answered so many questions: her remains. Meanwhile, the legal pressure on Fotis increased. The investigation was no longer confined to New Canaan. It was spreading across Connecticut. The timeline of May 24th was becoming clearer. And investigators increasingly believed that the answer to Jennifer's disappearance lay within the movements of the people closest to her. By the beginning of 2020, the case reached a dramatic turning point. On January 7th, Fotis Dulos was arrested and charged with murder, felony murder, and kidnapping. The accusations were now explicit. Prosecutors alleged that Jennifer had been attacked at her home and that Fotis had attempted to conceal what he had done. But even then, the most important question remained unanswered. Where was Jennifer? The arrest could not bring her home. The charges could not tell her children where she was. And the courtroom could not yet provide the final chapter. Then, only weeks later, another shocking event would change the case again. Fotis Dulos would be found in critical condition after an apparent suicide attempt. He would die 2 days later. The man accused of killing Jennifer would never stand trial for her murder. And suddenly, the investigation entered a new and even more complicated phase. There would be no cross-examination of Fotis. No jury would hear him tell his story. No verdict would determine his guilt or innocence. His death left behind accusations, evidence, questions, and a family still searching for Jennifer. The case would continue without him. Michelle Troconis would eventually face a jury. Kent Mawhinney would face criminal proceedings. Prosecutors would present evidence gathered over years. Defense attorneys would challenge that evidence. And the public would hear details about the final days of Jennifer's marriage that had once belonged to the private world of a family. But beneath all of the legal proceedings was something simpler. Jennifer was still missing. The children were still without their mother. And somewhere, investigators believed, there was a final piece of the story that had never been recovered. Her remains. That absence would define the case. Because a courtroom can establish responsibility through evidence. A conviction can establish legal accountability. But for a family, justice is not always the same thing as closure. Closure can mean knowing where a loved one is. Knowing where they spent their final moments. Knowing where to place flowers. Knowing where to say goodbye. Jennifer's family never received that certainty. And so the story continued to move forward while, in another sense, remaining frozen in the morning of May 24, 2019. A mother drove her children to school. She returned home. And then she disappeared. Everything that followed would be an attempt to reconstruct the invisible line between those two facts. What happened after Jennifer walked through the door? Who was there? What was said? What happened in the garage? How did her vehicle end up miles away? Why were garbage bags discarded across Hartford? What did the cameras capture? What did the phones reveal? And what was left behind after someone believed the evidence could be erased? Those questions would become the foundation of one of Connecticut's most closely watched criminal investigations. But before the investigators could understand the crime, they had to understand the woman at its center. Not the missing woman. Not the presumed victim. Jennifer. A mother whose children knew her not from police photographs or newspaper headlines, but from everyday life. From the morning routines. From the familiar face waiting at home. From the small gestures that children often take for granted until they are suddenly gone. And that is where the tragedy of this story truly begins. Because when Jennifer disappeared, the world did not simply lose a name. 5 children lost their mother. A family lost its center. And a quiet Connecticut town became the stage for a mystery that would remain unresolved in its most painful detail. The world wanted to know what happened to Jennifer Dulos. Her family wanted something much simpler. They wanted her back. And as the investigation moved deeper into the final morning of her life, investigators would discover that the answers were not waiting in one dramatic confession. They were scattered everywhere. In the places people had traveled. In the things people had thrown away. In the digital traces they had left behind. And in the silence that followed Jennifer's disappearance. The search for those answers was only beginning. Before Jennifer Dulos became a photograph on a missing person poster, before her name was repeated in news reports across Connecticut, she had a life that had nothing to do with police tape or courtrooms. She was a mother. She was a daughter. She was a woman who had spent years building a family and trying to protect the life she had created for her children. And that is the part of Jennifer's story that can easily disappear beneath the details of the investigation. When a person vanishes under mysterious circumstances, the world naturally begins asking the same questions. What happened? Who did it? Why? Where is the victim? But behind those questions is another one that deserves to be asked first. Who was the person who disappeared? Jennifer Faber Dulos was 50 years old when she vanished. Her life had already passed through many chapters before that final morning in May 2019. She was not defined by the circumstances of her disappearance. She had interests, relationships, responsibilities, memories, and, above all, 5 children whose lives were deeply connected to hers. For those children, Jennifer was not a headline. She was simply Mom. She was the person associated with the ordinary structure of their days. The person whose presence could be so familiar that it was easy to assume it would always be there. That is one of the cruelest things about losing someone suddenly. The mind keeps expecting them. A child may look toward a doorway. A phone may ring. A familiar routine may begin. And for a moment, the world seems normal. Then reality returns. Jennifer's children were still young when she disappeared. Their lives had already been disrupted by their parents' divorce and custody battle. They had been living through a family separation that was difficult enough under ordinary circumstances. Then their mother disappeared completely. There was no gradual goodbye. No final family dinner. No opportunity to prepare. No chance for Jennifer to tell her children that she loved them one last time. There was only the sudden absence of the person they expected to come home. The tragedy becomes even more painful when viewed through the ordinary details of motherhood. Children remember small things. The way a parent says goodnight. The way they prepare food. The way they ask about school. The way they know when something is wrong without being told. The way a familiar voice can make an ordinary room feel safe. Those details do not appear in police reports. They do not become evidence exhibits. They cannot be presented to a jury as proof of a crime. But they are the details that make a person real. Jennifer's life had been centered around her family for years, and the custody conflict that developed during her divorce made the protection of her children an increasingly important part of her world. The marriage to Fotis had begun in 2004. For many years, the two built a family together. 5 children came into their lives. There were homes, schedules, celebrations, school days, vacations, and the countless responsibilities that come with raising a family. But somewhere along the way, the relationship began to break down. By 2017, Jennifer had filed for divorce. A divorce can be painful even when both people accept that a relationship has ended. But when children, property, finances, and custody become part of the dispute, the separation can become something much more complicated. In Jennifer's case, the conflict over the children became particularly intense. She moved with them to New Canaan. Fotis remained in Farmington. The family that had once shared a household was now divided between 2 homes. For the children, this meant living between 2 worlds. For Jennifer, it meant trying to create stability while navigating an increasingly complicated legal battle. And according to allegations later presented in court documents, Jennifer had concerns about Fotis and what might happen during the divorce. Those claims would become significant after her disappearance. But they must be handled carefully. A court filing can contain allegations. An accusation is not automatically a proven fact. And because Fotis died before he could stand trial for Jennifer's murder, there was never a criminal verdict establishing his guilt. That distinction matters. It would be easy to look backward from the tragedy and interpret every argument, every disagreement, and every fear as a warning that the ending was inevitable. Real life is rarely that simple. People can live through painful divorces without violence. People can make threats they never act upon. People can be angry without becoming killers. But investigators would eventually look at the history of Jennifer's marriage because they were trying to understand why she had disappeared. And the divorce became impossible to ignore. Jennifer's relationship with her children was at the center of that conflict. She wanted to remain their mother in every meaningful sense of the word. She wanted to be present in their lives. She wanted to protect their future. And she was fighting through a legal system where decisions about custody could determine how much time each parent would spend with them. For someone already living through the emotional collapse of a marriage, that kind of conflict can become exhausting. Court hearings. Lawyers. Documents. Arguments. Negotiations. Waiting. Then starting over again. It is easy to imagine that exhaustion as a series of dramatic moments. But often it is something quieter. A phone call that changes your mood for the entire afternoon. An email that arrives late at night. A legal document sitting on a kitchen counter. A calendar filled with appointments. A child asking a question that you do not know how to answer. A parent trying to reassure a child while carrying fears of their own. That was the world Jennifer was living in before the morning of May 24th. She was not simply preparing for an unknown future. She was trying to raise 5 children while navigating a separation that had become increasingly hostile. And then came the final morning. There is something especially disturbing about the fact that Jennifer's last known day began with her children. She drove them to school. For them, it was another morning. They may have been thinking about classes, friends, homework, or what they would do after school. They had no reason to understand that the ordinary goodbye would become the last time they saw their mother alive. Jennifer then returned home. From there, investigators would later reconstruct a timeline that placed enormous importance on the hours that followed. Approximately 8:05 in the morning. Approximately 10:25. A little more than 2 hours. Those 2 hours would become a space filled with questions. What happened during that time? Was Jennifer alone when she arrived home? Did someone come to the house? Was there an argument? Was there a confrontation? How quickly did the situation escalate? Investigators would eventually conclude that Jennifer had been attacked at her home. But the full sequence could never be told by Jennifer herself. That is what makes a case without a recovered body so difficult. The victim cannot describe the final moments. There is no complete eyewitness account from the person who experienced them. Investigators must reconstruct what happened through what remains. And what remained at Jennifer's home was disturbing. Blood was discovered in the garage. Investigators believed the scene showed signs of an attempt to clean it. Those details would later become central to the prosecution's theory. But before the evidence became part of a courtroom argument, the garage had been part of Jennifer's ordinary life. It was simply another part of her home. A place associated with arriving and leaving. A place associated with cars and family routines. After May 24th, it became something else. A crime scene. That transformation is difficult to comprehend. A home can contain memories for years. Then one event can permanently change the meaning of a room. A doorway becomes the place where someone may have entered. A flaw becomes evidence. A vehicle becomes a clue. An object that once seemed meaningless becomes part of a forensic investigation. For Jennifer's family, the house could no longer simply be remembered as the place where she lived. It became the place where investigators believed the final known chapter of her life began. And then there was the vehicle. Jennifer's Toyota Suburban was found approximately 3 miles away, near Lapham Road and Waveney Park. Jennifer was not inside. The vehicle's location created another mystery. Why had it been left there? Who had driven it? When had it been moved? And what had happened to Jennifer between the time she was last known to be at home and the moment the vehicle was discovered? These questions transformed Jennifer's disappearance into a physical puzzle. The investigators began following movement. The vehicle. The people connected to it. The phones. The roads. The cameras. And eventually, the garbage bags. But even as investigators followed those clues, Jennifer herself remained at the center of everything. Her absence was not just an investigative problem. It was a human wound. Her children needed answers. Her mother, Gloria Farber, would become one of the most visible voices seeking justice for Jennifer. And the family faced a reality that no family should have to face. They could not bury Jennifer. They could not visit a grave. They could not know where she spent her final moments. They had to mourn someone whose physical absence remained unresolved. That kind of grief can be suspended between hope and certainty. There is no ordinary goodbye. There is no final place. There is only the question. Where is she? Years after Jennifer disappeared, that question would remain painful. The legal system would eventually move forward. Charges would be filed. A jury would hear evidence. Michelle Traconis would be convicted of crimes connected to the disappearance. But none of those developments could give Jennifer's children back their mother. None could erase the morning when she drove them to school. None could change the final image of her as she left them and continued with what should have been another ordinary day. That is why Jennifer's story deserves to be told as more than a murder investigation. Because if the only image left behind is the photograph of a missing woman, something important has already been lost. Jennifer had a life before the headlines. She had a family before the investigation. She had dreams and frustrations, ordinary mornings and difficult nights. She had 5 children who knew her as a living person rather than a case file. And whatever happened on May 24, 2019, it did not erase the life she had lived before that day. It only erased the possibility of more. More birthdays. More school mornings. More conversations. More photographs. More ordinary afternoons. More moments that nobody would think to remember because they assumed there would always be another one. That is perhaps the most painful truth hidden inside any sudden disappearance. We rarely recognize the last ordinary moment while it is happening. Jennifer could not have known that the morning she drove her children to school would become a permanent dividing line in their lives. Her children could not have known that the person waving goodbye would never return. Her family could not have known that they would spend years searching for answers. And investigators could not have known, when the first missing person report was filed, just how complicated the case would become. But the evidence would begin to speak. The blood in the garage. The abandoned vehicle. The phone records. The surveillance footage. The garbage bags. The movements across Connecticut. And the people closest to Jennifer. Every piece would eventually be examined. Every timeline would be questioned. Every explanation would be tested. And somewhere inside those fragments, investigators believed, was the truth about what happened to Jennifer Dulos. But the truth would not arrive in one dramatic revelation. It would emerge slowly. Piece by piece. And as the investigation moved forward, Jennifer herself would become increasingly absent from the story in the most literal sense. The people around her would speak. The lawyers would speak. The police would speak. The prosecutors would speak. The defense would speak. But Jennifer could not. Her silence was not a choice. It was the consequence of what investigators believed had happened to her. And that silence would make every unanswered question feel heavier. Where was Jennifer taken? How did she leave her home? Who was responsible? What happened to her body? And why had someone gone to such lengths to conceal what had happened? Those questions would soon pull investigators deeper into the final morning of Jennifer's life. The woman behind the photograph would become the center of a case built from fragments. But before the fragments could be assembled, there was one final ordinary detail to remember. Jennifer had taken her children to school. She had driven home. She was supposed to continue living her life. She was supposed to see her children again. Instead, her life ended somewhere inside a morning that had begun without warning. And from that moment forward, the people who loved Jennifer would spend years trying to recover what the disappearance had taken from them. Not only Jennifer, but certainty, peace, and the simple ability to say where their mother was. That was the beginning of the long search for Jennifer Dulos. Part 3, the woman who was still waiting for tomorrow. Long before Jennifer Dulos became the woman whose photograph appeared on television screens and missing person posters, she was living a life built around tomorrow. Tomorrow meant another school morning. Another meal. Another appointment. Another conversation with one of her 5 children. Another page in a life that, despite its difficulties, was still moving forward. That is how most lives are lived. Not as a sequence of dramatic moments, but as an accumulation of ordinary ones. Days blend into weeks. Problems are solved or postponed. Children grow. Parents age. Houses change. Relationships evolve. People make plans because they assume there will be time to carry them out. Jennifer was doing exactly that. She was raising 5 children while trying to navigate the collapse of her marriage to Fotis Dulos. The marriage had begun in 2004. At some point, the relationship had become a family. 5 children came into their lives, bringing with them the constant movement and responsibility that defines a household with children. There are years in a family's life that are difficult to remember individually because they are so full of routine. School mornings, birthday parties, homework, grocery shopping, sports, doctor's appointments, holidays, arguments over bedtime, lost shoes, forgotten lunches, messages from teachers. A family can spend years moving through these small moments without realizing how much they will eventually matter. Jennifer's life was made from those moments. But by 2017, something fundamental had changed. Jennifer filed for divorce. The decision marked the beginning of a period that would eventually become central to the investigation into her disappearance. A marriage can end quietly. This one did not. The separation developed into a bitter dispute, especially over the custody of the children. 5 children meant that the consequences of every legal decision extended far beyond the 2 adults involved. Where would the children live? How much time would they spend with each parent? What would their daily routine look like? Who would make decisions for them? How would holidays be divided? How would the children understand the separation? Questions that might appear simple on paper can become deeply emotional when they involve real families. Jennifer moved with the children to New Canaan. Fotis remained in Farmington. The family that had once occupied the same household now existed across 2 different homes. The geography of the family had changed. So had its emotional landscape. The divorce proceedings became increasingly contentious, and Jennifer expressed concerns about Fotis in legal filings and other statements. Those concerns would later be examined through the lens of what happened to her. But it is important not to allow hindsight to distort the past. A fear expressed during a difficult divorce is not automatically proof that a future crime was inevitable. An allegation is not a conviction. And because Fotis died before he could stand trial for Jennifer's murder, there was never a criminal verdict establishing his guilt. That distinction matters because the story of Jennifer Dulos contains 2 different realities. There is the reality established through evidence and legal proceedings. And there is the reality of allegations, fears, interpretations, and competing accounts. They cannot simply be treated as the same thing. What can be said with certainty is that the relationship between Jennifer and Fotis had deteriorated severely by the time she disappeared. The conflict had become serious enough to involve lawyers and courts. The future of the children had become part of the legal battle. And Jennifer was living under circumstances that were far removed from the family life she had once known. She was no longer simply trying to maintain a marriage. She was trying to separate from it. And when children are involved, separation rarely means that 2 people truly disappear from each other's lives. Even after a marriage ends, the parents remain connected through the children. Every custody exchange becomes a point of contact. Every holiday becomes a negotiation. Every school event can become complicated. Every decision can create another disagreement. That was the environment surrounding Jennifer in the years before her disappearance. There was another important change in Fotis' life. He was living with Michelle Triconis. Triconis would later become one of the most important figures in the criminal investigation into Jennifer's disappearance. Her relationship with Fotis placed her inside the story at a moment when Jennifer and Fotis were still locked in a bitter custody dispute. After Jennifer vanished, investigators would examine Triconis' movements, statements, communications, and relationship with Fotis. But at the time, she was simply another person living within the complicated network surrounding the family. No one looking at that household from a distance could have known what the future held. No one could have known that the divorce dispute would eventually become part of a murder investigation. No one could have known that Jennifer's home would become a crime scene. And no one could have known that the 5 children would lose their mother. The children were the most important part of Jennifer's life. They were also the part of the story that made the consequences of her disappearance impossible to measure. When an adult disappears, investigators search for clues. When a mother disappears, 5 children are left behind with questions that cannot be solved by evidence alone. Where is Mom? Why isn't she coming home? When will she come back? What happened? Children do not experience absence the way investigators do. A detective sees a timeline. A child sees an empty chair. A detective sees a missing vehicle. A child sees a mother who does not answer the phone. A detective studies surveillance footage. A child remembers the last time they heard a parent's voice. The difference is enormous. And it is one reason Jennifer's disappearance became so painful for the people closest to her. Her children were not simply witnesses to the aftermath. They were living inside it. Their mother had disappeared without an explanation they could understand. And then the adults around them began speaking in words that belonged to another world. Police. Investigation. Evidence. Search. Court. Charges. Murder. Those words do not belong in a child's ordinary vocabulary. But suddenly they were part of the children's lives. Jennifer's own mother, Gloria Faber, became an important figure in caring for the children after Jennifer's disappearance. The children needed stability. They needed somewhere to wake up. Somewhere to eat. Somewhere to sleep. Somewhere that still felt like family. But the person who had provided much of that emotional center was gone. And unlike a normal bereavement, there was no grave. There was no place to visit. There was no final confirmation through the recovery of remains. There was uncertainty. For years, the family had to live with that uncertainty. Meanwhile, investigators were trying to determine whether Jennifer's disappearance had been planned, spontaneous, or connected to the conflict surrounding her divorce. The answer would eventually be built through evidence rather than a single explanation. But to understand the investigation, it is important to understand the emotional landscape in which Jennifer had been living. The divorce was not simply paperwork. It was a transformation of her family. She had moved. Her children were living in a different home. The custody dispute continued. And according to allegations later examined by investigators, Jennifer feared that the conflict could escalate. Again, those concerns must be treated as allegations rather than proof of criminal intent. But they help explain why the custody battle became so important after Jennifer vanished. Investigators were not looking at a random disappearance. They were looking at the disappearance of a woman whose marriage had ended in conflict and whose relationship with her estranged husband remained legally and emotionally complicated. That did not prove who had harmed her. But it gave investigators a direction. They needed to understand the relationships around Jennifer. They needed to identify people with access to her. They needed to know who knew her schedule. Who knew where she lived? Who knew where her children went to school? Who could anticipate her movements? And who might have had a reason to want to control what happened next? The closer investigators looked, the more important the ordinary details became. Jennifer's schedule. Her children's school. Her home. Her vehicle. Her phone. Her appointments. The morning routine. Everything that had once been mundane became potentially significant. That is often what happens in a criminal investigation. The ordinary becomes evidence. A road is no longer just a road. It becomes part of a timeline. A phone is no longer just a phone. It becomes a record of movement. A vehicle is no longer just transportation. It becomes a piece of physical evidence. A garbage bag is no longer trash. It becomes a possible container of secrets. And Jennifer's home was no longer simply where she lived. It became the place investigators believed her final known movements began. The morning of May 24, 2019, Jennifer drove her children to the New Canaan Country School. The children left the vehicle. The school day began. Jennifer continued on. At some point, she returned to her home on Wells Lane. That was the last known chapter of her life. But the woman who returned home that morning was not simply a figure in a timeline. She was carrying everything that had happened before. The years of marriage. The birth and raising of 5 children. The divorce. The custody battle. The move to New Canaan. The fears and frustrations that had accumulated. The hopes she still had for her children. Whatever happened next, it happened to a woman who had spent years building a life around those children. That context gives the disappearance a different weight. Jennifer was not walking away from an empty life. She had reasons to return. People waiting for her. Children who expected her. Plans that presumably extended beyond that morning. And then the future stopped. The exact moment is unknown. Investigators would later identify a critical window between approximately 8:05 and 10:25 that morning. Somewhere inside that period, they believed Jennifer was attacked. But because she was never recovered, the final sequence could never be reconstructed with complete certainty. There are questions that remain unanswered. What was the first sign of danger? Did Jennifer realize what was happening? Did she have time to react? Did she attempt to defend herself? How quickly did the situation unfold? Was there a confrontation? Was there a plan? Was anyone else present? The evidence could provide fragments. It could establish movements. It could connect objects. It could reveal patterns. But it could never give Jennifer's own account of the final moments. That silence is one of the defining features of the case. Jennifer's voice was absent. The investigation would have to speak for her. And investigators would begin with the physical environment she left behind. The garage. The vehicle. The house. The evidence. But before the investigators arrived at those discoveries, there had been a final moment in which Jennifer's life still looked completely ordinary. Perhaps she had walked through her house expecting to begin the day's responsibilities. Perhaps she had thought about her children. Perhaps she had checked her phone. Perhaps she had looked at the clock. Perhaps she had been thinking about the custody dispute. Perhaps she had been thinking about something completely unrelated. We cannot know. That is the danger of filling missing moments with imagination. True crime can easily become a story where every silence is given a meaning and every unknown detail is turned into certainty. Jennifer's case deserves better than that. Where the evidence ends, the story must acknowledge uncertainty. What investigators believed happened must be distinguished from what can be conclusively proven. And what Jennifer herself experienced can never be fully known unless new evidence emerges. But one thing is certain. She did not return to her children. As the hours passed that day, someone began to notice. Jennifer was not where she was expected to be. She was not answering. The normal rhythm of her life had broken. By the evening, concern had become a missing person report. And once police entered the picture, Jennifer's private life began to be reconstructed from the outside. Investigators would examine the marriage, the divorce, the custody dispute, the people surrounding Jennifer, her movements, her phone, her car, the places connected to her, the evidence at her home, and eventually, the strange trail that would lead investigators away from New Canaan. But at the heart of every question was still one woman. Jennifer. The mother whose children had seen her that morning. The woman who had returned home. The woman whose future had been interrupted. The woman whose body would never be found. For her family, the absence would become permanent. For investigators, it would become a puzzle. For prosecutors, it would become a case. For the public, it would become a mystery. But for 5 children, it would remain something far more personal. Their mother was supposed to come home. She didn't. And from that moment forward, every part of Jennifer's life before the disappearance would be examined in an attempt to understand what happened after it. The marriage. The divorce. The custody battle. The fears. The relationships. The movements. The final morning. Everything would eventually point toward the same unanswered question. What happened to Jennifer Dulos after she returned home? The answer would not be found in one place. It would be scattered across Connecticut. It would hide in digital records and surveillance images. It would be carried in vehicles. It would be thrown into garbage containers. It would emerge through forensic evidence. And it would eventually enter a courtroom. But before the case could become a story about murder, it had to begin as something else. A mother had disappeared. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between the ordinary moments of her life and the extraordinary tragedy that followed, investigators would begin searching for the truth. Jennifer had spent years building a life for her children. On May 24, 2019, that life was shattered. And the first person to realize that something was terribly wrong would not yet know how far the investigation would eventually lead. They would only know one thing. Jennifer was gone. Part 4. The morning everything changed. May 24, 2019 began like an ordinary Friday. There was nothing in the morning air to suggest that by nightfall, a family would be searching for a mother, police officers would be examining a suburban home for signs of violence, and investigators would begin reconstructing a timeline that would eventually become one of the most important pieces of a murder investigation. For Jennifer Dulos, the day began with her children. That detail matters because it places her in the middle of the most ordinary part of her life before everything changed. A mother preparing her children for school. A car ride. A familiar route. A goodbye. Then home. The children were dropped off at the New Canaan Country School. Jennifer continued on her own. She was expected to continue her day like any other parent. There were things to do. Places to be. Responsibilities waiting. Instead, investigators would later focus on the narrow window between approximately 8:05 and 10:25 that morning. 2 hours. A little more than 2 hours in which the known timeline became uncertain. 2 hours that would eventually carry the weight of an entire criminal investigation. At approximately 8:05, Jennifer's movements were still connected to the ordinary rhythm of the morning. By approximately 10:25, investigators believed something terrible had happened. But between those points, the story becomes fragmented. There was no complete eyewitness account of what happened inside the house. There was no recording of every moment. There was no recovered body that could answer the questions investigators needed answered. Instead, there were traces. Small pieces. Physical evidence. Digital information. Vehicle movements. Surveillance images. And the absence of Jennifer herself. Investigators believed that Jennifer was attacked inside or near her home. The garage would become particularly important. When police examined the property after she was reported missing, they discovered what appeared to be blood in the garage. There were also indications that someone may have attempted to clean the area. That discovery transformed the meaning of everything around it. Before the blood was found, there was a missing woman. After the blood was found, investigators had to consider the possibility of violence. And if violence had occurred, the obvious question was where Jennifer had gone. The house was there. The vehicle was not. Jennifer was not. The children were elsewhere. And the clock was moving. A missing person case can begin with uncertainty. People disappear for many reasons. Sometimes they leave voluntarily. Sometimes they become unreachable because of an accident. Sometimes there is a medical emergency. Sometimes there is a misunderstanding. Investigators cannot assume the worst without evidence. But evidence was beginning to point toward something much darker. The blood. The apparent cleaning. The abandoned vehicle. The circumstances of Jennifer's disappearance. Each detail increased the seriousness of the investigation. And then came the vehicle. Jennifer's Toyota Suburban was found approximately 3 miles from her home, near Lapham Road and Waveney Park. The vehicle was not where investigators would have expected it to be if Jennifer had simply returned home and continued her day. It had been left behind. Jennifer was not there. That created a second physical location that investigators now had to examine. Her home. And the place where her vehicle was found. The space between them became part of the investigation. Who drove the vehicle? When? Why? Where was Jennifer? Was she inside the vehicle at any point? Did someone move it after she disappeared? Every possibility had to be considered. The vehicle became another fragment of the timeline. And the timeline was becoming increasingly important. Because if investigators could determine where people were at particular times, they could begin separating possibilities from impossibilities. This is where modern criminal investigations often become less like detective stories and more like enormous puzzles. A phone can place someone near a location. A camera can show a vehicle passing through an intersection. A GPS record can reveal movement. A toll record can establish a route. A surveillance camera can capture a face, a car, or simply a sequence of events. One piece may mean very little by itself. But several pieces can become powerful when they point in the same direction. Investigators began examining the people closest to Jennifer. And Fotis Dulos quickly became important. He was Jennifer's estranged husband. The divorce had been ongoing since 2017. The custody dispute remained contentious. He was also living with Michelle Troconis. On the day Jennifer disappeared, investigators began examining Fotis's movements. Phone data became particularly important. The device associated with Fotis placed him in areas that investigators considered relevant. One of those areas was Hartford. And Hartford would soon become the location of one of the most striking sequences in the entire case. Albany Avenue. Surveillance footage. A vehicle. Multiple stops. Garbage bags. At first glance, there was nothing inherently suspicious about a person throwing away garbage. People dispose of trash every day. A bag goes into a container. A vehicle drives away. The moment disappears. But investigators had a different perspective. They were not watching an ordinary day. They were reconstructing the movements of a man connected to a woman who had disappeared. According to investigators, Fotis stopped at more than 30 locations along a stretch of Albany Avenue more than 4 miles long. At each location, garbage bags were discarded. The pattern mattered. Not one stop. Not two. A sequence. The kind of sequence that invites investigators to ask why. Why so many locations? Why that route? Why those bags? And what was inside them? Police began recovering the discarded bags. The contents would become important evidence. Some items were believed to be connected to Jennifer. Some showed signs of blood. The investigation was no longer simply tracking movement. It was tracking an apparent effort to remove evidence from the places where investigators might find it. This is one of the moments when a missing person investigation can change direction completely. A person who disappears creates a question. A trail of discarded objects creates another. What was someone trying to hide? The investigators did not need to answer that question immediately. They needed to preserve the evidence. They needed to identify where each item came from. They needed to determine whether the objects could be connected to Jennifer. They needed to establish whether the blood belonged to her. They needed to understand the relationship between the objects, the vehicle, the locations, and the people involved. Forensic testing would become part of the story. So would surveillance. So would digital records. And gradually, the investigation began to produce something resembling a timeline. Jennifer was last known to be alive after taking her children to school. She returned to her home. Something happened during the critical morning window. Her vehicle was later found abandoned. Fotis' movements became a focus of the investigation. Garbage bags were discarded across Hartford. Investigators recovered objects they believed were connected to Jennifer. And back at Jennifer's home, there was evidence suggesting violence. Yet one crucial question remained. Where was Jennifer? No matter how many clues investigators found, the absence of her body remained a massive gap. Without her remains, they could not physically examine the final location of her death. They could not determine every detail of how she died. They could not identify a grave. They could not return her to her family. But a body is not always necessary to establish that a person has been murdered. In some cases, the surrounding evidence can become overwhelming. The disappearance, the blood, the circumstances, the behavior of people connected to the victim, the attempts to conceal evidence, the digital trail, the physical trail. The totality of the evidence can create a picture. That picture was beginning to emerge in the Jennifer Dulos investigation. But there was another complication. The case involved people whose relationships were already deeply strained. Jennifer and Fotis were not strangers. They were connected by nearly 15 years of marriage and 5 children. That connection made the investigation emotionally complicated. If Fotis was involved, investigators had to understand why. If he was not involved, investigators had to determine who else could have had access to Jennifer. The custody battle could provide a possible motive. But motive alone could not prove murder. Investigators needed evidence. And they were beginning to find it. As the day of May 24th moved toward evening, Jennifer's absence became increasingly impossible to explain. People who expected to hear from her did not. She did not return. She did not appear. She could not be reached. The concern became serious enough for police to be contacted. And when officers entered the investigation, they encountered a scene that was far more disturbing than a simple missing person case. The blood in the garage changed everything. It suggested that Jennifer may have been injured there. If the blood was hers, the implications were enormous. If someone had attempted to clean it, that raised another question. Who had done it? And why? A person attempting to clean a crime scene is not simply removing a stain. They may be attempting to erase a sequence of events. To remove the physical traces that could tell investigators what happened. But physical evidence is difficult to erase completely. Blood can leave microscopic traces. Fibers can remain. DNA can survive. A cleaning attempt can itself become evidence. The effort to make a scene appear normal can reveal that someone knew there was something to hide. Investigators would eventually argue that this was part of a larger pattern. And that pattern would extend far beyond the garage. The discarded garbage bags in Hartford would become another piece. The phone data would become another. The surveillance footage would become another. The vehicle would become another. The custody dispute would provide context. And Jennifer's disappearance would connect them all. But there was still no final answer. No one could say with absolute certainty where Jennifer was. The investigation had clues, but not closure. Her family had questions, but not Jennifer. And the 5 children were facing a reality that no child should have to face. Their mother had vanished. The person who had taken them to school that morning would not be there that evening. The ordinary rhythm of family life had been broken. And while investigators began searching, the family was forced to wait. Waiting can be its own form of suffering. Every phone call can bring hope. Every unfamiliar vehicle outside can raise expectations. Every reported sighting can create a moment of possibility. then the possibility disappears. For Jennifer's family, the search would continue. Police search areas connected to the investigation. They followed leads. They examined evidence. They spoke to people who knew Jennifer. They questioned those closest to her. The investigation expanded. And with every new piece of information, the same question returned. What happened after Jennifer drove her children to school? The answer would eventually lead investigators toward the people closest to her. But the path would not be straightforward. There would be arrests. There would be denials. There would be competing explanations. There would be legal battles. And there would be one of the most dramatic developments in the case when Fotis Dulos was eventually charged with murder. But that was still months away. On May 24th, the investigation was only beginning. The detectives did not yet know how long the case would last. They did not know that Jennifer's body would never be found. They did not know that Fotis would die before his murder case could reach a jury. They did not know that Michelle Traconis would eventually stand trial years later. All they knew was that a woman was missing. And the evidence at her home suggested that she might not have left voluntarily. The first night of the search would become the beginning of a much larger investigation. New Canaan would no longer be simply the place where Jennifer lived. It would become the starting point of a trail. That trail would extend to Hartford. It would pass through surveillance cameras. It would follow phone signals. It would lead investigators to trash containers. And it would eventually enter a courtroom. But on that first night, the most important evidence was still at the beginning of the story. The garage. The blood. The vehicle. The silence. Jennifer was gone. And the people searching for her were beginning to realize that they might not be searching for someone who had simply chosen to leave. They might be searching for a woman who had been attacked in her own home. If that was true, then the question was no longer simply where Jennifer had gone. The question was who had taken her. And as investigators began looking at the people closest to her, one name would become impossible to ignore. Fotis Dulos. Her estranged husband. The father of her 5 children. The man who had once shared her home. The man with whom she was locked in a bitter custody dispute. And the man whose movements on the day Jennifer disappeared would soon become one of the most closely examined elements of the entire case. The investigation had found its first major direction. But it had not yet found the truth. That would take months. And the road to that truth would reveal a trail far more disturbing than anyone initially imagined. The last morning of Jennifer Dulos's life had ended. The search had begun. And somewhere between New Canaan and Hartford, investigators believed the first answers were already waiting. By the time investigators began reconstructing the hours after Jennifer Dulos disappeared, the case had already moved beyond the question of whether she had simply left home. The garage had raised alarms. The abandoned Toyota had raised more questions. And the circumstances surrounding Jennifer's disappearance had begun to point toward violence. But investigators still needed something more. They needed a trail. They needed to know where the people connected to Jennifer had gone that morning, what they had done, and whether their movements could be connected to the evidence discovered at her home. Modern investigations often depend on details that seem almost invisible when they happen. A phone connects to a tower. A vehicle passes beneath a camera. A person walks toward a trash container. A door opens. A bag disappears. None of these events necessarily means anything by itself. But when investigators place them in the correct order, a story can begin to emerge. That was what happened in the Jennifer Dulos investigation. The search moved beyond the quiet streets of New Canaan and toward Hartford. One of the most important locations became Albany Avenue. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from the area and identified a sequence of movements they considered significant. A vehicle appeared. It stopped. A person got out. A garbage bag was carried toward a trash container. The person returned to the vehicle. The vehicle moved on. Then the pattern happened again. And again. And again. According to investigators, Fotis Dulos stopped at more than 30 locations along a stretch of Albany Avenue extending for more than 4 miles. To understand why that mattered, imagine looking at the footage without knowing what would eventually be found. A man driving through Hartford. He stops at a container. Throws something away. Leaves. A few minutes later, another stop. Another bag. Another container. Nothing dramatic. No obvious confrontation. No visible crime. Just a series of ordinary actions that would have been meaningless on almost any other day. But this was May 24, 2019. Jennifer was missing. Investigators believed she had been attacked. Evidence suggesting blood had been found at her home. Her vehicle had been abandoned. And now, someone connected to the case appeared to be traveling through Hartford and disposing of multiple bags. The footage became a map. Every stop became a potential evidence location. Every container became a possible source of information. Investigators began recovering the bags. The work was methodical. They could not simply assume that everything found inside was connected to Jennifer. They had to identify the objects. They had to preserve them. They had to determine where each item had come from. They had to establish whether blood or other biological material was present. And they had to determine whether the evidence connected to Jennifer, to Fotis, or to someone else. The investigation was moving from suspicion to physical evidence. That distinction was critical. A person can look suspicious. A person can behave strangely. A person can have a motive. But criminal investigations require evidence that can withstand scrutiny. The discarded bags offered investigators something tangible. They could be collected, catalogued, tested, photographed, presented in court. And some of the items recovered would become important pieces of the prosecution's case. Investigators found clothing and other objects that were believed to be associated with Jennifer. Some items showed signs of blood. The significance of those findings would later be argued in court, but at this stage, investigators were simply building their evidence file. Each object was another fragment. The investigation was becoming a process of reconstruction. If Jennifer had been attacked at home, and if someone had later attempted to conceal evidence, then there might be traces of that effort. The goal was to find them. One of the most powerful aspects of physical evidence is that it does not have to explain itself. A camera can show movement. A phone can show location. But a physical object can sometimes connect a person directly to a place or event. That is why the garbage bags mattered. Someone may believe that once an object enters a trash container, it disappears from the world. But investigators do not treat garbage as ordinary garbage when they believe it may contain evidence. They follow the trail backward. Where was it discarded? Who discarded it? What was inside? Where did the object originate? Could it be connected to the victim? Could it contain DNA? Could it contain blood? Could it reveal what happened? The investigation into Jennifer's disappearance was beginning to resemble an enormous forensic puzzle. And the pieces were spread across multiple locations. New Canaan, Hartford, Farmington, roadways, vehicles, homes, phones, trash containers. The investigators were not simply looking for Jennifer. They were looking for the story of what happened to her. At the center of that story was Fotis Dulos. His relationship with Jennifer made his movements particularly important. They were estranged. They were involved in a custody dispute. And on the day Jennifer disappeared, his movements were being reconstructed through digital and physical evidence. Phone records became part of that reconstruction. Investigators could examine where the device connected to cellular networks and compare those locations with surveillance footage. This kind of evidence can be extremely powerful because it can reveal movement over time. But it is not magic. A phone does not tell investigators what a person was thinking. It does not automatically prove why someone went somewhere. It simply creates a record of where a device was connected or detected. Investigators then have to combine that information with everything else. In Jennifer's case, the digital trail was particularly important because it could be compared with the physical trail. The phone placed photos in certain areas. The camera showed movement. The garbage bag showed disposal activity. The physical evidence suggested an attempt to conceal something. The investigators began asking whether all of these pieces belonged to the same story. They believed they did. But another person was also becoming increasingly important. Michelle Troconis. Troconis was Fotis' partner. She had been living with him in Farmington. Her relationship with Fotis meant she was close to the events surrounding his life during the period when Jennifer disappeared. Investigators questioned her about what she knew. Her statements would later become a major part of the case. But in the early stages, police were still trying to separate what Troconis knew from what they believed she had done. That distinction would become critical. Because knowledge of a crime is not necessarily participation in a crime. Being in a relationship with a suspect does not automatically make someone guilty. And being present during events does not necessarily establish criminal intent. Investigators had to prove specific actions. They had to establish what Troconis knew, what she saw, what she did, and whether she participated in efforts to conceal evidence. The investigation would eventually produce allegations that she helped Fotis clean up or dispose of evidence. Troconis would deny involvement in Jennifer's murder. Years later, a jury would hear the evidence and reach a different conclusion about her criminal responsibility for several offenses connected to the disappearance. But that was still far in the future. In the early days of the investigation, the focus was on evidence. And the evidence was multiplying. Back at Jennifer's home, the garage remained one of the most disturbing elements. Investigators believed that blood had been left there. They believed there were signs of cleaning. If Jennifer had been injured in the garage, the blood could help establish what happened. Forensic specialists could examine the material. They could determine whether it was human blood. They could test whether it matched Jennifer. They could examine the distribution of the blood. They could look for patterns. They could determine whether there were other biological traces. A crime scene does not always provide a complete narrative. Sometimes it provides fragments of a narrative. A stain. A fiber. A fingerprint. A piece of clothing. A damaged surface. A missing object. Each fragment becomes another question. The investigators were beginning to ask those questions systematically. What happened in the garage? Why was there blood? Why did someone appear to clean the area? What happened afterward? Where was Jennifer taken? And what happened to her body? The last question remained the most difficult. Jennifer was still missing. Search teams continued looking. Areas connected to the investigation were examined. Law enforcement followed leads. People reported possible sightings. But none produced Jennifer. The absence of her body became one of the defining characteristics of the case. For investigators, it meant that every other piece of evidence had to carry more weight. For the family, it meant that there was no physical place where grief could settle. There was no grave. No final location. No certainty about her last moments. The search continued because the family needed answers. And because the investigation needed to know whether Jennifer had been killed, where she had been taken. As the weeks passed, the investigation became more intense. The initial missing person report had evolved into a major criminal investigation. The people surrounding Jennifer were being scrutinized. The relationship between Jennifer and Fotis was being examined. The custody dispute was being examined. The movements of Fotis were being examined. Tragedies was being questioned, and evidence was being collected from the streets of Hartford. The discarded bags became especially important because they represented something investigators believed was an effort to move evidence away from the original crime scene. If someone had wanted to hide evidence, why choose so many separate trash locations? Perhaps the goal was to make recovery more difficult. Perhaps the person believed that spreading the bags across multiple locations would make the objects impossible to connect. Perhaps there was another explanation. Investigators did not need to speculate publicly. They could follow the evidence. The cameras had already given them the locations. Now the recovered objects could potentially tell them what those stops meant. This is where the case became a battle between concealment and reconstruction. Someone appeared to have attempted to make evidence disappear. Investigators were attempting to make it visible again. The garbage bags were no longer anonymous. They had become evidence. The cameras had transformed ordinary streets into a timeline. The phone records had transformed digital activity into a map. The abandoned Toyota had transformed a vehicle into a clue. The blood had transformed a garage into a potential crime scene. And Jennifer's absence connected everything. But investigators still needed to know exactly what happened. The possibility of murder was becoming stronger. Yet proving murder without a body would require an extraordinary amount of evidence. The prosecution would eventually have to demonstrate that Jennifer was dead and that someone was responsible. They would have to explain why the evidence pointed toward Fotis. They would have to explain what happened to Jennifer. And they would have to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt if the case ever reached trial. At this stage, however, the investigators were not yet in a courtroom. They were in the field. They were following leads. They were collecting bags. They were examining cameras. They were analyzing phones. They were reconstructing movements. And every day that passed without Jennifer made the case more urgent. The family waited. The children waited. Investigators searched. And the public watched. Jennifer's photograph became familiar across Connecticut. A woman with a calm expression. A face frozen in time. For people who had never met her, the photograph became the image of a missing mother. For her family, it was the face of someone they knew. Someone whose absence had become impossible to accept. The search for Jennifer continued, but the investigation was beginning to move toward another stage. The police were no longer simply asking where she might be. They were examining the possibility that someone had deliberately erased her trail. And if that was true, then the trail itself could become evidence. Every attempt to hide something could leave another trace. Every movement could be recorded. Every discarded object could be recovered. Every phone could preserve a location. Every camera could preserve a moment. The more investigators looked, the harder it became to make the evidence disappear. But the investigation still had obstacles. There was no body. There was no eyewitness who could provide a complete account of the alleged murder. And the people at the center of the case had their own versions of events. Fotis denied killing Jennifer. Tragedies denied involvement in her murder. The defense would later challenge the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. The investigation therefore had to do more than collect suspicious facts. It had to connect them. A single garbage bag was not enough. A single camera recording was not enough. A single phone location was not enough. A single bloodstain was not enough. But what about all of them together? That was the question investigators were building toward. Could dozens of small pieces form one coherent story? Could the movements of a vehicle, the timing of phone data, the location of discarded objects, and the evidence at Jennifer's home establish what happened? The investigators believed they could. And slowly, the case began moving toward its first major legal confrontation. In June 2019, Fotis and Tragedies were arrested on charges related to the handling of evidence and obstruction. The charges were serious. But they were not yet murder charges. The investigation was still developing. Police continued looking for Jennifer. The search continued. The evidence continued to accumulate. And the family continued waiting for the one discovery that could change everything. Jennifer. But that discovery never came. Instead, the investigation moved deeper into the evidence surrounding her disappearance. The discarded bags became a trail. The trail became a timeline. The timeline became a theory. And the theory would eventually become a criminal case. But before that happened, investigators would have to uncover something even more important. They would have to determine whether the person they were following had not only been connected to the evidence, but had also been connected to Jennifer at the exact moment she disappeared. That meant reconstructing the morning of May 24th minute by minute. The school. The drive home. The house. The garage. The vehicle. The roads. The phones. The cameras. The trash containers. Every piece had to fit. Because somewhere inside that sequence was the answer to the question that had haunted Jennifer's family since the first night. Where did Jennifer go? And who made sure she could not come home? The trail was getting clearer. But the truth was still buried beneath layers of uncertainty. And investigators were about to take the next step. They were going to follow the evidence back to the people closest to Jennifer. The search for Jennifer had begun with a missing mother. Now it was becoming a case about a suspected murder and an alleged attempt to erase the evidence. And the more investigators reconstructed the trail, the more difficult it became to believe that Jennifer had simply disappeared. Someone, they believed, had made her disappear. The question was who? And the answer would soon bring the investigation to a critical turning point. Part 6, the investigation closes in. As the summer of 2019 unfolded, the search for Jennifer Dulos became more than a search for a missing woman. It became a reconstruction of a crime that investigators believed had been carefully concealed. Every day brought another question. Every answer created another question behind it. And at the center of everything remained the same unbearable fact. Jennifer was still missing. Her children were still waiting for answers. Her family was still hoping that investigators would find her. But the evidence was increasingly pointing toward the possibility that Jennifer would never come home. The investigation was now moving in several directions at once. Detectives were studying the evidence from Jennifer's New Canaan home. They were examining the abandoned Toyota. They were analyzing phone records. They were reviewing surveillance footage. They were recovering discarded objects. And they were questioning the people closest to Jennifer. Among them, Fotis Dulos occupied a unique position. He was not simply someone who happened to know Jennifer. He was her estranged husband. He was the father of her 5 children. He was deeply connected to the custody dispute that had become one of the defining conflicts of their lives. And investigators were increasingly interested in his movements on the morning Jennifer disappeared. The more they examined the timeline, the more important those movements became. A murder investigation often turns on time. People can lie about what they did. They can misunderstand what they remember. They can deny being somewhere. But digital records, surveillance footage, and physical evidence can sometimes create a timeline that is difficult to escape. Investigators began comparing one source against another. If a phone placed someone in one area, did a camera show the same person there? If a camera showed a vehicle, did phone data support the movement? If a suspect claimed to have been somewhere else, did the evidence agree? The process was slow. It required patience. It also required investigators to resist the temptation to decide the answer too early. Because once investigators believe they know what happened, there is a danger of interpreting every new piece of evidence as confirmation. A strong investigation must do the opposite. It must test its own theory. If the evidence does not fit, the theory must change. Jennifer's case was complex precisely because the most important physical evidence was missing. There was no body. No final resting place. No direct eyewitness to the alleged killing. That meant investigators had to build their case through circumstances. The blood in the garage became one part. The vehicle became another. The discarded bags became another. The digital records became another. The relationship between Jennifer and Fotis provided context. But context was not proof. Investigators needed to establish a chain. And the chain was beginning to take shape. The surveillance footage from Hartford was particularly significant. Investigators believed that Fotis had traveled through the city and stopped repeatedly to discard garbage bags. The number of stops made the activity stand out. More than 30 locations. A stretch of Albany Avenue extending for several miles. A sequence that could be reconstructed. Each stop gave investigators another place to search. Each recovered object gave them another opportunity to connect the movements to Jennifer. The work required investigators to go backward. They knew where a bag had been discarded. They needed to determine what was inside. They needed to know whether the object could be linked to Jennifer. They needed to establish when the bag had been placed there. They needed to connect the disposal to the person shown in the footage. It was a process of turning movement into evidence. The garbage bags became more than trash. They became markers on a map. The map showed a pattern. The pattern raised suspicion. The evidence inside the bags gave that suspicion substance. Investigators found items believed to be connected to Jennifer, including clothing and objects bearing signs of blood. The significance of those findings would eventually be debated in court. But during the investigation, they represented another indication that someone may have been trying to remove evidence from the original location. And that brought investigators back to the garage. The garage had become one of the most important locations in the case. The presence of blood suggested that something violent may have happened there. The signs of cleaning suggested that someone may have attempted to alter the scene. For investigators, the question was not simply whether someone had cleaned the garage. It was whether the cleaning was connected to Jennifer's disappearance. Forensic analysis could help answer part of that question. Biological evidence could identify whose blood was present. The location and distribution of blood could help investigators understand what may have happened. Other traces could potentially establish who had been in the area. The scene did not speak in sentences. It spoke in fragments. A stain here. A trace there. A missing object. A recovered item. A vehicle moved to another location. Each fragment had to be examined without assuming what it meant. That was the challenge. And it became even more complicated when investigators examined Fotis' relationship with Michelle Troconis. Troconis was living with Fotis at the time. She was therefore positioned close to him during the period surrounding Jennifer's disappearance. Investigators questioned her about what she knew and what she had seen. Her statements would later become central to the prosecution's case. But in 2019, the investigation was still trying to determine exactly what role she had played. The first arrests in June were connected to allegations of tampering with evidence and obstruction. They were not murder convictions. They were an indication that prosecutors believed actions had been taken after Jennifer disappeared to interfere with the investigation. Fotis and Troconis denied wrongdoing. For the investigators, the arrests were not the end. They were another step. The search for Jennifer continued. The case remained open. And the evidence continued to accumulate. As the months passed, the investigation became more focused. The possibility that Jennifer had been killed was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The blood. The vehicle. The evidence disposal. The surveillance. The phone data. The circumstances of her disappearance. Taken individually, each piece could potentially be explained. Taken together, investigators believed they formed a much stronger picture. But the question remained. Where was Jennifer? Search teams examined locations connected to the investigation. Law enforcement searched areas in Connecticut and beyond. They looked for evidence that might lead them to Jennifer's remains. The absence of a body became a constant obstacle. It also became a source of pain for the family. A family can begin to grieve after a confirmed death. But Jennifer's family had to live with something more complicated. They knew investigators believed she had been murdered. They knew evidence suggested violence. But they could not bring her home. They could not know where she had been taken. They could not stand beside her grave. There was no physical ending. Only an empty space. And as investigators worked, the children were being cared for by Jennifer's family. Their lives had to continue even as the investigation grew more intense. School still happened. Meals still had to be prepared. Days still passed. Children still grew older. But the absence of their mother remained. The case was now attracting enormous public attention. Jennifer's photograph was everywhere. People who had never met her learned her name. News organizations followed the investigation. Every new development became a headline. Every search raised expectations. Every arrest raised questions. And every unsuccessful search brought disappointment. The public wanted an answer. The family needed one. The investigators needed evidence. And the legal system needed proof. These were not always the same thing. A family can believe something happened. Police can suspect something happened. Prosecutors can argue that something happened. But a criminal conviction requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard would eventually become crucial. For now, investigators were building the case. And the pressure was increasing on Fotis. The allegations against him were becoming more serious. His movements on May 24th were being examined in detail. The evidence collected from Hartford was being analyzed. The relationship with Jennifer was being scrutinized. The custody dispute was being revisited. And prosecutors were examining whether there was a motive connected to the fear of losing control over the children. But again, motive alone could not establish guilt. Investigators needed to show what happened. They needed to show how. They needed to show who. They needed to show where. And they needed to explain why someone would go to such lengths to conceal Jennifer's disappearance. The investigation eventually reached another important figure. Kent Mawhinney. Mawhinney was a friend of Fotis and had also served as his attorney. On January 7, 2020, Mawhinney was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. He denied the allegation. His involvement added another layer to an already complicated case. The investigation was no longer centered on one relationship. It was now examining a network of people connected to Fotis. Investigators were trying to determine whether anyone else had assisted in planning or concealing what they believed had happened to Jennifer. The alleged involvement of another person raised a difficult question. Had the disappearance been spontaneous? Or had someone planned what happened? If it had been planned, how far in advance? Who knew? Who helped? Who remained silent? And where was Jennifer? The investigation was moving toward a critical moment. For months, Fotis had faced charges related to evidence tampering and obstruction. Now prosecutors were preparing to take a much more serious step. On January 7, 2020, Fotis Dulos was arrested and charged with murder, felony murder, and kidnapping. The allegations were now unmistakable. Prosecutors accused him of killing Jennifer and attempting to conceal the crime. The charges represented a dramatic escalation. For Jennifer's family, it was a moment of painful significance. The man they believed investigators were identifying as the central suspect was now formally accused of killing her. But even an arrest could not answer the most painful question. Where was Jennifer? The murder charges could establish the direction of the case. They could not provide her family with a body. They could not provide a grave. They could not provide a final goodbye. And the absence of Jennifer meant that the investigation was still incomplete. The case had become a bodiless murder prosecution. The prosecution would have to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. the defense would challenge the interpretation of that evidence. And Fotis would have the opportunity to contest the allegations in court. But he would never get that opportunity. Only weeks after being charged with murder, Fotis disappeared from the legal process in another devastating way. On January 28, 2020, he failed to appear at a court hearing. Police went to his home. He was found in critical condition after an apparent suicide attempt. He was taken to the hospital. For a brief period, there was uncertainty over whether he would survive. Then, on January 30th, he died. The death changed everything. The central suspect in Jennifer's presumed murder was gone. There would be no murder trial against him. No jury would hear his defense. No prosecutor would cross-examine him. No judge would sentence him. And no one would ever hear him answer, under oath, where Jennifer was. For the family, his death created another kind of unanswered question. If he knew what happened, he could no longer tell them. If he knew where Jennifer was, that information was now locked inside a story that had ended with his death. The investigation did not end. But it changed. Without Fotis, prosecutors turned greater attention toward the other defendants. Michelle Troconis remained. Kent Mawhinney remained. The evidence remained. Jennifer remained missing. And the question of what happened on May 24 remained unresolved. Troconis would eventually face trial. But first, investigators had to continue assembling the evidence. The case would depend heavily on what people said, what cameras recorded, what phones revealed, and what investigators recovered. It would also depend on what the prosecution could prove about the actions of those who remained. The investigation had started with a missing woman. It had become a presumed murder. Then a murder prosecution against a husband. Then the death of that husband. And now the case was moving toward another courtroom. But before that courtroom, investigators had to reconstruct one final thing. Not just where everyone went, but what they believed happened. The evidence was there. The surveillance was there. The phone records were there. The blood was there. The discarded items were there. The custody dispute was there. But Jennifer was not. And that absence would remain the single defining fact of the case. As 2020 began, the investigation had reached a point where the questions were no longer simply about finding a missing person. They were about proving a crime. The police believed they had uncovered enough evidence to charge Fotis with murder. But because he was dead, that accusation would never be tested in a murder trial. The legal process would continue through the people prosecutors believed had helped conceal what happened. And eventually, Michelle Troconis would sit before a jury. The evidence gathered over years would be presented piece by piece. The surveillance footage would be shown. The movements would be explained. The discarded evidence would be examined. Witnesses would testify. Defense attorneys would challenge the prosecution's interpretation. And jurors would be asked to decide whether the evidence established criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. But that future courtroom battle was still ahead. For now, investigators were left with the evidence and the silence. Jennifer's silence. Fotis' silence. And the silence of a case in which the central victim had never been found. The investigation had closed in. But it had not reached closure. And somewhere in that gap between evidence and certainty lay the final mystery of Jennifer Dulos. Where was she? What happened to her after she returned home? Who was responsible? And how much of the truth had already been buried with the man who would never stand trial? The answers would eventually emerge through another person. Michelle Troconis. And the case against her would become the next major chapter in the story of Jennifer Dulos.